The afternoon sun hung low over the mountain highway, turning the winding road into a ribbon of gold. Expensive cars rushed past without slowing, each driver eager to reach the luxury resort hidden beyond the forest. Among them was a sleek black limousine worth more than most homes, gliding smoothly around the sharp curves. Inside sat 58-year-old billionaire Jonathan Hayes, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country. His schedule was planned down to the minute. In less than an hour, he was supposed to sign the largest business deal of his career, a contract that would make headlines across the world. His phone buzzed again. "Sir," his assistant's voice came through the speaker. "Everyone is waiting. Investors from 3 countries have already arrived." "I'll be there in 40 minutes, Jonathan replied calmly, but 40 minutes would never come. As the limousine rounded another bend, a small figure suddenly stepped into the middle of the road. The driver slammed on the brakes. The tires screamed against the pavement. The limousine stopped only a few feet away. Jonathan lurched forward, catching himself against the leather seat. "What on earth?" the driver shouted. Standing in front of the enormous vehicle was a skinny boy no older than 12. His faded blue hoodie looked several sizes too big. His jeans were patched at both knees, and his worn-out sneakers were barely holding together. Cars behind them began honking furiously. The boy didn't move. His breathing was fast, but his eyes never left Jonathan's. Then, in a trembling voice that somehow sounded strangely certain, he said only 4 words. "Please, trust me now." Jonathan frowned. "What is this?" The driver reached for the horn again. "I'll call the police." But the boy shook his head urgently. "No," he pointed toward the mountainside towering above the road. "Don't stay here." Jonathan looked through the tinted window. Nothing, just rocks, trees, silence. The driver muttered impatiently, "Sir, he's probably trying to scam us." Jonathan glanced at his expensive watch. Every second mattered. Every delay could cost millions, yet something about the boy refused to let him look away. It wasn't fear, it wasn't desperation, it was conviction, the kind that couldn't be faked. The boy stepped closer, almost whispering now. "You have to move the car, right now." Jonathan had spent 40 years negotiating billion-dollar decisions. He trusted numbers, contracts, and evidence, not frightened children standing in the middle of nowhere. He reached for the door handle. "I'll handle this myself." The moment his polished shoes touched the pavement, the boy grabbed his sleeve, not roughly, but firmly. "Please," his voice cracked. "If you wait even 10 more seconds." He couldn't finish the sentence. Jonathan followed the boy's trembling gaze toward the cliff above. Still nothing. Then, a tiny pebble bounced onto the road. Driver laughed nervously. "It's just a rock." Another pebble fell, then another. Jonathan's heartbeat slowed for reasons he couldn't explain. The boy wasn't looking at him anymore. He was staring at the mountain with absolute terror. "Run," he whispered. The word barely left his mouth before the entire mountainside exploded. The sound was deafening. Thousands of tons of rock broke free at once, crashing toward the highway like an unstoppable wave. "Move," Jonathan shouted. The driver slammed the accelerator. The limousine surged backward as enormous boulders smashed onto the exact spot where it had been standing only seconds earlier. Dust swallowed everything. Trees snapped like toothpicks. The road disappeared beneath a mountain of stone. Jonathan stood frozen beside the car, unable to breathe. If that boy had arrived even a few seconds later, if the brakes had taken just a little longer, if he had ignored those 4 simple words. Every person inside the limousine would now be buried beneath hundreds of tons of rock. Silence settled over the valley. Only the distant echo of falling stones remained. Jonathan slowly turned toward the boy, but the child wasn't celebrating. He wasn't smiling. Instead, he simply sank to the ground, exhausted, as though every ounce of strength had left his body. Jonathan hurried over. "Son," the boy looked up. For the first time, Jonathan noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes. The dirt on his hands, the fresh scratches covering his arms. He looked less like someone seeking attention and more like someone who had been fighting something long before the limousine ever appeared. "What is your name?" Jonathan asked softly. "Eli. How did you know?" The boy looked toward the broken mountainside. "I heard it." Jonathan blinked. "Heard what?" "The mountain." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The driver exchanged a puzzled glance with the security guard. "The mountain," he repeated. Eli nodded. "My grandpa taught me." Jonathan frowned. "Taught you what?" Eli hesitated, as if revealing something deeply personal. "When rocks begin to shift inside the mountain, they make tiny sounds." The billionaire stared at him. "Almost nobody notices them." Jonathan had spent decades funding engineering projects, tunnels, bridges, and construction companies. He knew enough about geology to understand that mountains sometimes gave warning signs, tiny cracks, loose stones. Unusual sounds, but recognizing them from hundreds of feet away, that seemed impossible. "You recognized it?" Eli looked embarrassed. "My grandpa always said," he smiled sadly. "The mountain always whispers before it shouts." Jonathan glanced back at the collapsed highway. Emergency sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Police would arrive soon. News helicopters would follow. The story would spread everywhere. But one question refused to leave his mind. How could a 12-year-old boy possess knowledge that had just saved dozens of lives? Before Jonathan could ask another question, a weathered backpack lying beside Eli caught his attention. The zipper was broken. A piece of rope held it closed. Inside, Jonathan noticed something unexpected. Not toys, not snacks, books, several old science books. A worn notebook filled with careful sketches of rocks, trees, streams, and mountain slopes. Every page was covered with handwritten observations, dates, weather conditions, drawings of tiny cracks in stone. It looked less like a school notebook and more like the field journal of an experienced researcher. Jonathan carefully picked it up. "You made all these?" Eli nodded shyly. "I've been writing things down since I was 8. Jonathan slowly turned another page, hundreds of entries, each one unbelievably detailed. Some described birds changing their flight paths before storms. Others recorded underground vibrations after heavy rain. One page simply read, "When the birds become silent, listen to the rocks." Jonathan felt a strange chill. Who had taught a child to notice things the rest of the world ignored? And why was someone with this extraordinary gift standing alone on a lonely mountain road instead of sitting in a classroom where his talent could change lives? For the first time in years, Jonathan Hayes forgot completely about the billion-dollar meeting waiting for him. Because deep inside, another question had become far more important. Who was Eli? And what had life done to a boy like him that he was standing alone on this mountain instead of being exactly where someone with his remarkable mind belonged? Jonathan couldn't stop looking at the battered notebook in his hands. Its pages weren't filled with childish doodles or homework. They were filled with observations, careful, patient, almost scientific. The handwriting was neat despite the worn paper. 3 days after heavy rain, small cracks appear near the eastern ridge. Birds leave the pine trees before rocks begin falling. The stream becomes cloudy several hours before the hillside moves. Every sentence had a date beside it. Every prediction had a result written underneath. Jonathan slowly closed the notebook. "This isn't ordinary," he whispered. Eli immediately reached for it. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for anyone to see it." Jonathan handed it back gently. "You have nothing to apologize for." The boy carefully slid the notebook into his backpack as though it were the most valuable thing he owned. Within minutes, police cars and ambulances filled the mountain road. Firefighters climbed over the fallen rocks while engineers inspected the unstable cliff. One gray-haired geologist walked toward the collapsed hillside, stopped suddenly, and quietly shook his head. "If that limousine had stayed there another 5 seconds," he muttered. He never finished the sentence. Jonathan watched rescue crews measuring the enormous pile of stone, his business meeting, his investors, his schedule. None of it mattered anymore. His thoughts kept returning to the quiet boy standing alone beside the guardrail. An officer approached Eli. "Were you the one who stopped traffic?" Eli nodded nervously. "Yes, sir." How did you know? The boy lowered his eyes. I heard the mountain. Several officers exchanged confused looks. One smiled politely, clearly assuming it was luck. But the senior geologist didn't smile. Instead, he walked over to Eli. You said, you heard it. Yes. What exactly did you hear? Eli thought carefully. The rocks were clicking. The geologist's expression changed. What kind of clicking? Very small. He tapped two fingers together, like tiny stones tapping each other. The older man's eyes widened. What else? The birds stopped singing. He pointed toward the pine forest. The squirrels disappeared. He looked at the broken hillside. And the air smelled different. Jonathan noticed the geologist suddenly become very quiet. After a long pause, he finally asked, Who taught you all of this? My grandpa. The man's shoulders slowly relaxed. There used to be old mountain trackers who could recognize warning signs before landslides. He looked around at the younger officers. I've only read about them. Then he looked back at Eli. I've never actually met one. Jonathan stared at the old geologist. So he's telling the truth. The man nodded slowly. Some people spend their entire lives observing nature. He smiled softly. They notice things most of us stopped paying attention to years ago. Jonathan looked at Eli with completely different eyes. This wasn't luck. It was knowledge. Knowledge earned through patience. Knowledge hidden inside a child nobody seemed to notice. After the road was officially closed, Jonathan offered to drive Eli home. At first, the boy refused. I can walk, Jonathan smiled. After saving my life, I think you've earned a ride. Eli hesitated before quietly climbing into the limousine. For the first few miles, neither of them spoke. The luxury car felt strangely out of place beside the nervous child whose shoes left tiny traces of mountain dust on the spotless floor mats. Jonathan didn't mind. He had sat beside presidents and celebrities. None of them had impressed him as much as this silent 12-year-old. Finally, he asked, So, where do you live? Eli pointed toward a narrow dirt road branching away from the highway. There. The limousine turned onto it. The pavement disappeared almost immediately. The road became rough, surrounded by aging fences and forgotten farmland. Several small houses came into view. Many needed repairs. Some had broken windows. Others leaned slightly after years of neglect. The limousine finally stopped in front of the smallest house at the end of the lane. Its paint had almost completely faded. Part of the roof was covered by an old blue tarp. The wooden porch sagged under its own weight. Jonathan looked quietly at the little home. You live here? Eli nodded. With Grandpa. The front door opened before they could get out. An elderly man with silver hair hurried outside, limping slightly. The moment he saw Eli, relief flooded his face. There you are. He wrapped the boy in a tight hug. I've been worried sick. I'm okay, Grandpa. Only then did the old man notice Jonathan standing beside the limousine. His smile faded into confusion. Can I help you? Jonathan stepped forward. Sir, he extended his hand. Your grandson just saved my life. The old man blinked. I'm sorry. Jonathan spent the next several minutes explaining everything that had happened on the mountain. The grandfather listened silently. When Jonathan finished, the old man's eyes became wet. He looked down at Eli. I told you not to take that road alone. Eli smiled sheepishly. I know. But if I hadn't, the old man hugged him again. I know. Jonathan noticed something remarkable. Neither of them seemed surprised that Eli had recognized the danger, almost as if this wasn't the first time. Inside the modest house, Jonathan accepted a cup of tea. The living room was tiny. The furniture was old but spotless. Books covered nearly every shelf. Not expensive decorations. Books. Nature guides. Geology manuals. Bird identification books. Weather journals. Plant encyclopedias. Everything had clearly been read dozens of times. Jonathan slowly walked toward a wall filled with framed photographs. One picture immediately caught his attention. It showed the elderly man decades younger standing beside a team of rescue workers in front of a mountain helicopter. Another showed him receiving a medal. Another displayed him teaching several young park rangers. Jonathan looked back. Were you? A rescue ranger, the old man smiled modestly. For 38 years. Jonathan raised his eyebrows. In these mountains, most of my life, he pointed toward another faded photograph. Back then we didn't have drones, he chuckled softly. We had our eyes and our ears. Jonathan suddenly understood everything, the notebook, the observations, the confidence. Eli hadn't learned from the internet. He had learned from one of the finest mountain rescuers the region had ever known. That evening, while the grandfather prepared dinner, Jonathan wandered toward the backyard. Eli sat beneath an old oak tree repairing the strap on his backpack with fishing line. Jonathan quietly sat beside him. Do kids at school know about all this? Eli shrugged. They think I'm weird. Weird? They laugh because I collect rocks, he smiled faintly. They call me Mountain Boy, Jonathan frowned. And your teachers, they're nice. But, he looked down, we don't always have money for school trips. Jonathan noticed the careful way Eli avoided complaining. He never asked for sympathy, never blamed anyone. He simply stated facts, as though hardship had become normal. Jonathan looked toward the little house again. Where are your parents? For the first time, Eli didn't answer immediately. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves above them. Finally, he spoke. My mom died when I was 6. Jonathan's heart tightened. My dad left before I can remember. Smiled politely, trying to make it sound less painful than it really was. So it's just Grandpa and me. Jonathan didn't know what to say. He had spent years believing success came from working harder than everyone else. But sitting beside this child, he realized something uncomfortable. Some children begin life carrying weights no child should ever have to carry, yet somehow, Eli still found reasons to notice birds, to study mountains, to protect strangers, to save a man he had never met. Jonathan looked toward the setting sun. A quiet promise began forming inside him. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but one thing had become certain. Meeting Eli on that mountain was not an accident, and before this story was over, the life of one forgotten little boy, and perhaps his own, was about to change forever. Jonathan slept very little that night. The luxury suite reserved for him overlooked the mountains where he had nearly lost his life only hours earlier. Normally, he would have been reviewing contracts or answering emails until midnight. Instead, he sat alone on the balcony with a cup of untouched coffee, replaying the same moment again and again. A frightened 12-year-old standing in the middle of the highway. Please, trust me, now. 4 simple words, 4 words that had separated life from death. For decades, Jonathan had believed that money solved almost every problem. It could buy the best doctors, the safest cars, the strongest security, and the smartest advisors. Yet none of those things had saved him that afternoon. A poor boy had, and somehow that truth made every business victory in his life feel strangely small. The next morning, Jonathan canceled every meeting on his calendar. His assistant was stunned. Sir, investors have flown in from London, Singapore, and Dubai. I know. They've been planning this meeting for 6 months. I know. Should I reschedule? Jonathan looked out the window toward the distant mountains. No, the assistant stared in disbelief. Sir, this deal is worth nearly $3 billion. Jonathan smiled quietly. Yesterday I almost died. He paused. For the first time in years, I think I'm finally going to spend my day on something that actually matters. Less than an hour later, the black limousine rolled slowly back onto the dusty country road. Eli was outside splitting firewood with an old axe. The handle had been repaired with wire. His sleeves were rolled up despite the cool morning air. Every swing was careful, practiced, and steady. When he noticed the limousine, he froze. Jonathan stepped out carrying 2 paper bags from a local bakery. I hope you don't mind breakfast. Eli smiled shyly. Grandpa Thomas appeared from the porch, wiping his hands on an old towel. You really came back, Jonathan laughed. I wasn't sure you'd believe I would. The old man smiled. Most people don't. They shared breakfast on the weathered porch. Fresh bread, homemade jam, hot tea. It wasn't the most expensive meal Jonathan had ever eaten. It wasn't even close, but somehow, it felt richer than dinners he'd shared inside five-star hotels. After breakfast, Jonathan noticed Eli gathering several empty buckets. "What are those for?" "The spring." "The spring? Our well dried up last month." Jonathan looked toward the backyard. An old hand pump stood there. Rust covered most of it. "It doesn't work anymore?" Grandpa Thomas shook his head. "It would cost more to repair than we can afford." "So every day," Eli smiled, "I walk to the spring." "How far?" "About 2 miles." Jonathan blinked. "Each way?" The boy nodded. "Morning and evening." Without another word, Jonathan picked up one of the buckets. "I'll come." Eli laughed. "You don't have to." "I know. I want to." The trail wound through pine trees and narrow hillsides. Along the way, Eli seemed completely different from the shy boy Jonathan had met yesterday. He pointed toward broken branches. "A deer passed here before sunrise." A few minutes later, he stopped beside a muddy patch. "Fox!" Jonathan looked down. He saw nothing. Eli knelt and gently brushed away loose leaves. Fresh paw prints appeared. "How did you see that?" "They're easier to notice when the mud dries around the edges." Jonathan smiled. "I would have walked right past." "You usually do." "What do you mean?" Eli looked embarrassed. "Most people only look where they're going." He pointed toward the forest. "I like looking where life is happening." Jonathan found himself smiling. For someone who had grown up with so little, Eli noticed abundance everywhere. Bird songs, wild flowers, animal tracks, cloud shapes, tiny streams. The world still amazed him. Jonathan couldn't remember the last time the world had amazed him. At the spring, crystal clear water flowed from between two large rocks. Several neighbors were already there filling containers. An elderly woman smiled when she saw Eli. "There you are." She reached into her basket. "I baked too much bread again." Jonathan noticed the loaf she handed him was still warm. "You don't have to keep giving me things," Eli said softly. "Nonsense," she smiled. "You carried my groceries last week." Another man arrived with a pickup truck. "Eli," he handed the boy a small toolbox. "I finally fixed your grandfather's lantern." "No charge." Jonathan watched quietly. No one here seemed wealthy. Most of them struggled themselves. Yet almost everyone shared something. Bread, tools, time, kindness. It wasn't charity, it was community. As they walked back, Jonathan finally asked, "Does everyone help each other like this?" Grandpa Thomas smiled. "When you don't have much," he looked at the buckets of water. "You learn that sharing is cheaper than replacing." Jonathan looked down, ashamed. He had spent years surrounded by people who negotiated every favor. Here, kindness happened without contracts. Back at the house, Jonathan noticed a small wooden shed behind the garden. Its roof had partially collapsed. Inside sat dozens of strange-looking devices: homemade weather gauges, rain collectors, wind spinners, boxes filled with carefully labeled rocks, maps covered in handwritten notes. Jonathan looked around in amazement. "What is all this?" Eli's face brightened instantly. "My workshop." He picked up a homemade instrument made from old glass jars and fishing line. "It measures tiny ground vibrations." Jonathan blinked. "You built this?" "Mostly." "How?" The boy shrugged. "I found instructions in an old library book." Grandpa Thomas chuckled. "He takes apart anything that's already broken." Jonathan examined another device. It was made from bicycle spokes, old bearings, and pieces of scrap metal. "You made these from garbage?" Eli smiled proudly. "It isn't garbage." "It's parts." Jonathan laughed. That single sentence stayed with him. "It isn't garbage, it's parts." How many people had looked at Eli himself and seen only another poor child, while underneath, there was extraordinary potential waiting for someone to notice. Later that afternoon, Jonathan quietly called his assistant. "I need a favor." "Anything, sir." "I want you to find out everything about Cedar Valley Elementary." "The local school?" "Yes. I need information about funding." "Teachers, scholarships, science programs." His assistant hesitated. "Are you planning to make a donation?" Jonathan looked through the window. Eli was helping his grandfather repair the old chicken coop, laughing as though life had never treated him unfairly. Jonathan smiled. "No, I'm planning something much bigger." He ended the call, but before he could put his phone away, another call came in. It was the chief engineer investigating yesterday's landslide. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Mr. Hayes, yes, we've completed our survey. And," the engineer paused, "we found something strange." Jonathan frowned. "What is it?" The landslide wasn't entirely natural. A cold silence filled the room. "What do you mean?" "There are signs," the engineer inhaled deeply, "that someone may have been drilling into the mountain illegally." Jonathan slowly stood. "Illegal drilling, yes. And if that's true," another long pause, "the collapse may have been preventable." Jonathan looked toward Eli playing outside. The boy thought he'd simply heard the mountain whisper. But what if someone had forced it to scream? And if that was true, who had put dozens of innocent lives in danger? Jonathan suddenly realized that Eli hadn't only saved his life, he might also be the only witness capable of uncovering a truth that someone else desperately wanted to keep buried. Jonathan lowered his phone slowly. The cheerful sounds coming from the backyard suddenly felt very far away. Eli was laughing as he tried to keep 3 curious chickens from escaping through the broken fence. Grandpa Thomas leaned on his cane, smiling as he watched his grandson chase them across the yard. It looked like the simplest scene in the world, but Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about the engineer's words. The landslide wasn't entirely natural. If someone had been drilling into the mountain illegally, then the disaster that almost killed dozens of people wasn't just an accident. It was someone's greed, and greed had a way of hiding behind silence. That evening, Jonathan asked Grandpa Thomas if they could take a short walk. The old ranger agreed. They followed a narrow trail that overlooked the valley. When they were far enough away that Eli couldn't hear them, Jonathan quietly explained what the engineer had discovered. Grandpa Thomas stopped walking. His face became unusually serious. "I was afraid of this." Jonathan looked at him. "You suspected something." The old man nodded slowly. "For almost 6 months. Why didn't you report it?" "I did," Jonathan frowned, "more than once." He pulled a folded envelope from his jacket pocket. The paper was worn from being opened so many times. Inside were copies of letters addressed to the county environmental office. Each one described unusual truck tracks deep in the forest, fresh drilling marks on protected rock, explosions heard late at night, missing warning signs. Jonathan read every page. "Did anyone investigate?" Grandpa Thomas gave a tired smile. "They said there wasn't enough evidence. And after that, they stopped answering." Jonathan folded the papers carefully. "Why didn't you give up?" The old man looked toward the mountains. "Because mountains don't lie." The next morning, Jonathan asked Eli a question that surprised him. "Would you show me where you first noticed the sounds yesterday?" The boy nodded immediately. They hiked for nearly an hour before reaching a narrow ridge above the highway. Eli pointed toward a group of pine trees. "I was sitting there." "You come here often?" "Almost every Saturday." "What do you do?" "I watch," Jonathan smiled. "You watch the birds, the clouds, the streams, the rocks." Jonathan followed him deeper into the forest. Suddenly Eli stopped. His expression changed. "What is it?" The boy knelt beside the ground. Someone had driven heavy equipment through the area. Fresh tire tracks crossed the soft earth. Broken branches were scattered everywhere. Jonathan crouched beside him. "These are recent." Eli nodded. "They weren't here last week." A few yards farther, they found something else. A bright orange survey flag tied around a tree, then another and another. Jonathan looked around. The flags stretched deep into protected woodland. "This doesn't make sense." Eli pointed toward the hillside. "They came from there." They climbed another 100 yards. Hidden behind thick bushes stood a rusted metal gate. It had no official signs. No company name, no permit number, just a heavy chain and a padlock. Beyond it, Jonathan froze. Fresh excavation marks scarred the mountainside. Portable drilling equipment sat beneath camouflage tarps, fuel containers, piles of broken stone. Someone had been working there recently, very recently. Eli whispered, "This wasn't here before." Jonathan quickly took photographs with his phone, every angle, every machine, every tire track. Before they could leave, voices echoed from farther up the trail. Someone was coming. Jonathan grabbed Eli's shoulder. Down! They ducked behind a cluster of thick bushes. Moments later, 2 pickup trucks rolled through the gate. 4 men climbed out. None wore company uniforms. One carried a clipboard. Another pointed toward the damaged cliff. Jonathan carefully zoomed his phone's camera. The man with the clipboard spoke loudly. "We've got 1 week. What about yesterday?" "No witnesses." Jonathan's heart pounded. Another man laughed. "Even if someone talks," he shrugged. "Who's going to believe a kid?" Jonathan slowly turned toward Eli. The boy's eyes had gone wide. He had heard every word. They waited until the trucks disappeared before quietly hiking back. Neither of them spoke. Back at the house, Jonathan immediately contacted the engineer, then the county sheriff, then an environmental investigation unit he had personally funded years earlier. By sunset, officers surrounded the illegal drilling site. Equipment was seized, documents were collected. Several workers were taken in for questioning. Jonathan thought the nightmare was finally over. It wasn't. The following afternoon, a black SUV stopped outside Grandpa Thomas's house. A sharply dressed man stepped out carrying an expensive briefcase. He smiled politely. "Good afternoon." Grandpa Thomas remained on the porch. "Can I help you?" "My name is Victor. I represent a mining contractor." Jonathan happened to be inside reviewing photographs. When he heard the conversation, he quietly moved closer to the window. Victor continued smiling. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Grandpa Thomas folded his arms. "I don't think so." Victor opened the briefcase. Inside, bundles of cash, perfectly stacked, neatly wrapped. "There are $100,000 here." The old ranger didn't even glance at the money. "What do you want?" Victor's smile never changed. "We'd appreciate it if your grandson forgot what he saw." Silence. The birds stopped singing outside. Jonathan felt his jaw tight. Victor gently closed the briefcase. "If that isn't enough," he smiled again, "we can discuss another amount." Grandpa Thomas slowly walked down the porch steps until he stood only inches away from the man. Then he quietly said something Jonathan would never forget. "I spent 38 years pulling people off these mountains." He looked directly into Victor's eyes. "I will never sell the truth to someone who buries it." Victor's smile disappeared. He picked up the briefcase. "Think carefully." He glanced toward the house. "Children deserve peaceful lives." The meaning behind those words was impossible to miss. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat. Victor climbed back into the SUV and drove away. Jonathan immediately stepped outside. "I'm calling the police." Grandpa Thomas nodded. "They should know." "But they won't stop." Jonathan looked toward the road where the SUV had disappeared. "No, they won't." That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep again. He hired private security for the house before sunset. 2 vehicles remained outside until morning. He wasn't taking chances. Around midnight, Jonathan walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. A small light glowed beneath Eli's bedroom door. He knocked gently. "You still awake? Come in." Eli sat at a tiny wooden desk. His notebook lay open beside dozens of hand-drawn maps. Jonathan smiled. "I thought you'd be sleeping." "I couldn't." "Worried?" The boy nodded. "A little." Jonathan sat beside him. Then he noticed a drawing unlike any of the others. It wasn't a mountain, it wasn't a river, it was an old suspension bridge. Every support cable had been carefully sketched. Cracks were marked in red pencil. Jonathan pointed. "What's this?" Eli hesitated. "I wasn't sure if I should tell anyone." Jonathan felt a familiar chill. "What is it?" "I crossed that bridge yesterday morning." "And?" It sounded wrong. Jonathan's expression changed. "What do you mean?" "The cables. They've started singing." Jonathan stared at him. "Singing?" Eli nodded slowly. "The wind makes healthy cables hum." He swallowed hard. "But damaged ones, they whistle." Jonathan remembered exactly what Eli had said about the mountain. The mountain always whispers before it shouts. Now there was another warning. Another whisper. Another place where innocent lives might be in danger. and suddenly Jonathan realized something terrifying. The boy who had saved him once might already be trying to save someone else. Jonathan looked at the drawing for a long moment. Every cable, every support beam, every crack, everything was labeled with astonishing precision. "You drew this from memory?" Eli nodded. "I always draw places that feel different." Jonathan leaned closer. "What made you think something was wrong?" Eli picked up a pencil and traced one of the bridge's main suspension cables. "When I walked across yesterday morning, the wind wasn't very strong. So, the cable shouldn't have been making that sound." Jonathan frowned. "How do you know?" "My grandpa taught me that every bridge has its own voice." He smiled faintly. "If the voice changes—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Jonathan immediately stood. "We're checking it first thing tomorrow." Just after sunrise, Jonathan, Grandpa Thomas, Eli, and one of Jonathan's security officers drove toward the old suspension bridge. It connected two small farming communities separated by a deep river gorge. Every morning, school buses, delivery trucks, and dozens of families crossed it. As they approached, Jonathan noticed nothing unusual. Cars continued passing. Cyclists crossed without concern. Children walked along the narrow sidewalk carrying backpacks. Everything looked perfectly normal. Eli became unusually quiet. He rolled down the window. "Stop!" The SUV came to a halt about 100 yards before the bridge. Eli stepped out and simply listened. The wind drifted gently through the valley for several seconds. Nothing. Then Jonathan heard it, a faint, high-pitched whistle, almost like someone blowing softly across the top of a glass bottle. Eli closed his eyes. It got louder. Grandpa Thomas listened carefully. His expression darkened. "I hear it." Jonathan looked from one to the other. "You both think something's wrong?" The old ranger nodded. "I've heard that sound exactly twice." "When?" "The year before an old railway bridge collapsed." Jonathan's stomach tightened. Jonathan immediately called the county bridge authority. Within 30 minutes, 2 inspectors arrived. They looked over the structure for less than 15 minutes before shrugging. "We don't see anything." Jonathan pointed toward the cables. "Listen." One inspector laughed politely. "Sir, bridges make noises." Jonathan wasn't satisfied. "I want a full structural scan." The younger inspector shook his head. "Those require approval, and approval takes time." "How much time?" "Several weeks." Jonathan looked toward the bridge. Several weeks, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of children. He wasn't willing to gamble. Without saying another word, he took out his phone. "This is Jonathan Hayes. I'll personally pay for an independent engineering team. I want them here today." By late afternoon, a convoy of specialized inspection trucks arrived. The lead engineer introduced herself as Dr. Melissa Carter. Unlike the earlier inspectors, she listened carefully when Eli described the strange sound. She didn't smile. She didn't dismiss him. Instead, she asked questions. "What direction was the wind yesterday?" "Northwest." "What time?" "A little after 7. "What temperature?" "It was colder than today." She nodded thoughtfully. Then she ordered her team to begin ultrasonic testing on the suspension cables. Hours passed. Jonathan paced beside the bridge. Grandpa Thomas sat quietly on a nearby bench. Eli remained silent, watching the river below. Just before sunset, Dr. Carter walked toward them carrying a tablet. Her face was pale. "We found it." Jonathan stepped forward. "What?" She enlarged an image on the screen. One of the main load-bearing cables had fractured internally. Almost 40% of its steel strands had snapped. From the outside, it looked perfectly intact. Inside, it was slowly failing. Dr. Carter inhaled deeply. "If heavy traffic continued for another few weeks," she looked toward the bridge, "there's a very real chance this bridge could have collapsed." Jonathan felt his legs weaken. "How many people cross here every day?" "About 12,000. Silence. The bridge was closed immediately. Traffic was redirected. The evening news interrupted regular programming. "Emergency closure prevents potential disaster." No one outside the valley knew one quiet 12-year-old had heard what trained inspectors had missed. The following morning, reporters surrounded Grandpa Thomas's little house. Microphones, cameras, satellite vans, questions flew from every direction. Is it true your grandson predicted the bridge problem? How did he know? Is he some kind of genius? Can we interview him? Jonathan watched through the curtains. Eli slowly backed away from the window. I don't want to. Jonathan knelt beside him. You don't have to. I don't like cameras. Then there won't be cameras. Jonathan stepped outside. He politely thanked the reporters before asking them to leave the family alone. Most respected his request. A few didn't. One reporter shouted, Mr. Hayes, people deserve to know who saved them. Jonathan looked back toward the little house, then calmly answered, no. They deserve to know that someone cared enough to listen. That afternoon, Jonathan invited Eli and Grandpa Thomas to visit his headquarters in the city. Eli had never been inside a skyscraper before. His eyes widened as the elevator climbed higher and higher. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, employees immediately stood. Good morning, Mr. Hayes, Jonathan smiled. I'd like you to meet my friend. Every executive looked toward Eli. The boy nervously held his old backpack against his chest. Jonathan continued, This young man has taught me more in 3 days than I've learned in years. The room fell silent. No one laughed at Eli's patched shoes. No one stared at his faded hoodie. For the first time in a long time, people looked at him with genuine respect. Jonathan led them into a large conference room overlooking the city skyline. On the table sat a single folder. He slid it toward Grandpa Thomas. The old ranger adjusted his glasses. Inside were legal documents. He looked confused. What is this? Jonathan smiled. It's a scholarship. Grandpa Thomas frowned. For college? Jonathan shook his head. For everything. The old man looked again. Elementary school, middle school, high school, university, housing, books, medical care, transportation, research funding, every educational expense. Paid in full, not for 1 year, for as long as Eli wanted to learn. Grandpa Thomas's hands began trembling. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious. Eli stared silently at the papers. I don't understand. Jonathan smiled warmly. You once told me something. What? It isn't garbage. It's parts. He looked directly into the boy's eyes. The world keeps seeing your old clothes. I see what you're becoming. Tears slowly filled Grandpa Thomas's eyes. For several moments, no one spoke, because sometimes the greatest gift isn't money. It's finally being seen, yet none of them realized that the greatest surprise was still waiting. Because while Jonathan believed he was changing Eli's future, someone from Jonathan's own past had just learned the boy's name, and they were already on their way to meet him. 3 days later, Jonathan's office received an unexpected visitor. She didn't have an appointment. She didn't introduce herself with wealth or status. She simply stood quietly in the reception area holding a small envelope. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head, and her cardigan had been mended so many times that the stitching itself had become part of the pattern. When Jonathan's assistant asked her name, she smiled gently. My name is Margaret Ellis. I don't need much of Mr. Hayes' time. I only need 5 minutes. Something in her calm voice convinced the assistant to make the call. Jonathan agreed to meet her. When Margaret entered the office, her eyes immediately settled on a framed newspaper clipping hanging behind Jonathan's desk. It showed the headline that had spread across the country. 12-year-old boy prevents mountain tragedy. Beside it was another photograph. Young hero's warning saves thousands after dangerous bridge closure. Margaret smiled softly. So, it really is him. Jonathan stood. You know Eli? She nodded. I've known him since he was 7. Jonathan invited her to sit. She carefully placed the old envelope on his desk. I think it's time someone told you the rest of his story. Inside the envelope were several faded photographs. The first showed a tiny boy sitting alone in the corner of a public library. His feet barely touched the floor. An enormous science book rested across his lap. Jonathan recognized him immediately. Eli, Margaret smiled. He came every Tuesday. Every Tuesday for 5 years. Jonathan looked closer. The boy's clothes were just as worn then as they were now, yet his face was completely absorbed by the book in front of him. He never borrowed storybooks. Margaret laughed quietly. He always borrowed books about nature, weather, animals, mountains, engineering. Jonathan looked up. You worked at the library for 32 years. Margaret pointed toward another photograph. It showed Eli standing beside an old bookshelf. He wasn't old enough for some of the science books. So what did he do? He copied them. Jonathan frowned. Copied them? She nodded. He couldn't always afford to borrow the expensive reference books. So every afternoon, he sat there writing page after page into little notebooks. Jonathan suddenly remembered the worn journal inside Eli's backpack, the careful handwriting, the detailed sketches. Margaret smiled. I used to leave blank notebooks on the shelf. Jonathan looked confused. You did, she nodded. I pretended someone had forgotten them. So he would take them, so his pride wouldn't be hurt. Jonathan slowly leaned back in his chair. Another piece of the puzzle had quietly fallen into place. Margaret pulled out one final photograph. Jonathan's breath caught. It showed Eli standing beside a middle-aged woman wearing a park ranger's uniform. Both were laughing. The woman had her arm around his shoulders. Jonathan looked carefully. His mother, Margaret nodded. Sarah, what was she like? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She loved those mountains. She believed every child should learn to listen before speaking. Jonathan looked at the picture again. Eli's smile looked different, carefree, safe. What happened? Margaret lowered her eyes. There was a wildfire. Jonathan remained silent. Sarah stayed behind helping an elderly couple evacuate. She never came back. The room became painfully quiet. Jonathan finally understood why the mountains meant so much to Eli. They weren't simply landscapes. They were the last place he had shared with his mother. That evening, Jonathan drove back to Grandpa Thomas's house. He found Eli sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Without saying anything, Jonathan handed him the old photographs Margaret had given him. The boy's hands trembled. I haven't seen these in years. He gently touched the picture of his mother. I thought they were lost. Jonathan sat beside him. Margaret kept them safe. Eli smiled through tears. Mom always said. He looked toward the mountains glowing orange beneath the evening sky. That nature whispers before it warns. Jonathan felt goosebumps. The same thing your grandfather taught you. Eli nodded. They both believed people stopped listening. For several minutes they sat in comfortable silence. Finally, Jonathan asked something he had wondered since the day they met. When you stood in front of my limousine, were you scared? Eli laughed softly. I was terrified. You still did it. I kept thinking. He looked down at his worn sneakers. What if I'm wrong? Jonathan waited. But then I thought, what if I'm right? The words settled deeply inside Jonathan's heart. One frightened little boy had been willing to risk being embarrassed to save someone he'd never met. How many adults would have done the same? The following week, Jonathan announced something that surprised the entire country. He wasn't creating another luxury hotel. He wasn't buying another company. Instead, he established the Hayes Listening Initiative. Its mission was simple: identify talented children in overlooked communities, support retired teachers, fund rural libraries, protect local knowledge before it disappeared forever. Journalists asked him why. Jonathan answered with only one sentence. The greatest experts are not always the loudest voices. Construction soon began on a brand new learning center in Cedar Valley. But Jonathan insisted on one unusual condition. The building would not carry his name. It would be called the Sarah Ellis Discovery Center. When Eli learned why he couldn't speak, he simply hugged Jonathan as tightly as he could. Months passed. The old house received a new roof. The broken well was replaced with a modern water system. Grandpa Thomas finally accepted help, but only after Jonathan agreed to hire local workers so every family in the valley benefited. The whole town rises together, Grandpa Thomas insisted. Jonathan smiled. I think Eli gets that from you. One crisp autumn morning, the Discovery Center officially opened. Children filled the classrooms. Microscopes lined the science lab, shelves overflowed with books. Maps covered the walls. Outside, a small weather station overlooked the mountains. Near the entrance stood a bronze plaque. It didn't mention billionaires. It didn't mention money. It simply read, "Every great discovery begins with someone willing to notice what others overlook." Below those words appeared three names: Sarah Ellis, Thomas Ellis, Eli Ellis. As the ceremony ended, a little girl tugged gently on Eli's sleeve. She held an old notebook. "Do you think," she looked nervous, "you could teach me how to read animal tracks?" Eli smiled exactly the way his grandfather used to. "Of course." They walked toward the forest together. Jonathan watched them disappear among the pine trees. Years earlier, one librarian had quietly left blank notebooks on a shelf. One teacher had encouraged curiosity. One mother had taught her son to listen. One grandfather had shared a lifetime of wisdom. Each act seemed impossibly small at the time, yet together, they had saved lives, protected a community, inspired a nation, and reminded one billionaire that the world's greatest treasures are rarely found inside bank accounts. They are found inside ordinary people who choose kindness when no one is watching, courage when no one believes them, and hope when giving up would be easier. Because sometimes, one child who refuses to stay silent can echo louder than 1,000 powerful voices. And sometimes the greatest miracle isn't that someone is rescued. It's that one act of compassion begins a chain of kindness that keeps saving lives long after the moment itself has passed. 5 years later, the same mountain road was peaceful again. Fresh trees covered the scars left by the landslide. New safety barriers lined the highway, and warning sensors monitored every cliff. Travelers passed through without ever realizing how close this place had once come to becoming a tragedy. Near the roadside stood a small stone monument. It wasn't large. It wasn't covered in gold. It simply read, "In honor of the courage to speak and the wisdom to listen." Thousands of people stopped to read it every year. Very few knew the whole story. Across the valley, the Sarah Ellis Discovery Center had become one of the most respected learning programs in the region. Children from dozens of small towns came every weekend. Some wanted to study wildlife. Some dreamed of becoming engineers. Others simply wanted a quiet place where someone believed in them. At the entrance, visitors often saw a young teenager kneeling beside a group of children. It was Eli. He was taller now, but his smile hadn't changed. Instead of expensive clothes, he still preferred hiking boots and simple jackets. Instead of giving speeches, he asked questions. "What do you notice? What do you hear? What changed today that wasn't here yesterday?" The children learned that science wasn't just about textbooks. It began with paying attention. Jonathan Hayes still visited every month. His companies continued to grow, but something inside him had changed forever. He no longer measured success by quarterly profits. Every year, he personally interviewed students applying for the Hayes Listening Initiative. When they asked what qualities he looked for, his answer never changed. "I'm not searching for perfect grades. I'm searching for people who notice what everyone else overlooks." Grandpa Thomas lived long enough to watch hundreds of children walk through the Discovery Center's doors. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch with Jonathan, he smiled quietly. "You know, when Eli was little, I used to worry about him." Jonathan looked over. "Worry? I thought the world would laugh at him for noticing things other people ignored." He watched children exploring the nearby forest. "But then I realized the world didn't need Eli to become someone else. It needed someone exactly like him." Jonathan nodded. "I think it always did." Years later, when Grandpa Thomas peacefully passed away in his sleep, the entire valley gathered to honor him. Park rangers came from across the state. Engineers attended. Teachers, former students, families whose lives had been touched by his quiet wisdom. At the end of the memorial, Eli stood before the crowd. He didn't give a long speech. He simply held up the same worn notebook he had carried since childhood. The pages were faded, the corners were bent, the cover had been repaired many times. "This notebook," he said softly, "was never just mine. My grandfather filled it with his experience. My mother filled it with her love for nature. A librarian filled it with opportunity. A teacher filled it with encouragement. And one man," he looked at Jonathan, who was quietly wiping away tears, "filled it with hope." That evening, after everyone had gone home, Jonathan remained alone outside the Discovery Center. The sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. A gentle breeze moved through the pine trees. For a moment, he closed his eyes. He listened. Birds, leaves, flowing water, the quiet hum of life all around him. Then he smiled, because he finally understood the lesson that had taken nearly 60 years to learn. The richest people are not those who own the most. They are those who leave the most kindness behind. And sometimes, the greatest investment you'll ever make isn't in a company. It's in believing one overlooked child before the rest of the world does.